Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Today, we are going to talk about ACL injuries, and specifically in response to some stuff that has been going on within maybe more the sports world, and some questions, and people have been reaching out to me and asking for sort of my opinion on some of this stuff. And so I thought that I would address what has been happening, but also in the context a little bit of ACL injuries in dancers, because I've never actually done a podcast episode about that either. So for those of you who are longtime listeners, you probably know that I have a background in working a lot with sports, especially early on in my career, and I'm definitely still I would say, avid sports fan, and specifically women's sports. I think there are a lot of parallels that we can see between women's sports and how it is treated in society and how it is funded and how it is viewed, and the dance world. And ultimately, they are not the same thing. And women's sports, especially at a professional level, are probably arguably further ahead than the dance world in a lot of ways. But if we compare women's sports to men's sports and how they're perceived by society and all of these things, we see a lot of similarities. And so that's part of my interest in women's sports. And I also just like watching sports. And one of the sports that I follow quite a lot and watch a fair amount of is women's professional soccer. I am actually a season ticket holder to our new professional team here in Vancouver that just started like a month ago. So it is a sport that I follow, and in my circles of other friends that I have who are sport physical therapists, and even just my social media feed and things like that, I get a lot of especially women's sports content fed to me. I realize that you as a listener are probably much more ingrained in the dance world and maybe don't hear or see this information as much, but a couple of weeks ago, I think it was right at the end of April, FIFA announced, so FIFA is the governing body for soccer, FIFA announced that they are going to be funding a study looking at the hormonal influence on ACL injuries in female soccer players. So for those of you who maybe aren't aware, there's been a bit of an epidemic of ACL tears in female soccer or football, depending on where you are in the world, female soccer players, especially in recent years. And it's actually not a new phenomenon, but there's just a lot more eyes on women's professional sports right now. And so now we are seeing it more, and we are seeing some of like the top level players. So some of the best players in the world, like Sam Kerr recently sustained an ACL injury. There's been all sorts. Like I could literally name so many players. And it's not just in soccer, it's happening in basketball, it's happening in all sorts of sports. And so there's been a lot of media and a lot of attention on this. And so FIFA, like I said, just announced that they are going to be funding a study looking at the hormonal fluctuations that happen during the menstrual cycle for female athletes to see if there's potentially a correlation. Because female athletes, and particularly female soccer players, the stats hold true for other sports. I just don't know the exact numbers in other sports, but in female soccer players, they are 3 to 6 times more likely to sustain an ACL injury than their male counterparts. And so this is something that's drawn a lot of attention. Again, through the media, through the sports communities, and now FIFA is finally paying attention. And so they've announced that they're going to fund this study. And everyone is very, very excited about this. And I've had loads of people reaching out and being like, hey, did you see this news? This is so great, and all of this stuff. And that's kind of where the inspiration for today's podcast episode came from, because although I do think it's amazing that FIFA is going to be funding a study looking specifically at female ACL injuries, I'm not 100% sure that they're focusing their attention in the right place. And in order to prove my point, or just kind of to chat about that a little bit more, I want to also bring it back to the dance world and talk about ACL injuries in the dance world. So if this seems like a bit of a rogue episode, because I'm going to talk a lot about sports and not so much about dance, you'll see why in a minute. But like I said, lots and lots of people have been reaching out. There's been lots of excitement. There's been lots of people really excited within the sports medicine community that all of a sudden we're going to be looking at this. But like I said, I don't know that it's going to give us the answers and be the sort of be all and end all that we maybe hope that it might be, or it may not have as much effect on reducing the rates of ACL injuries as we potentially think it might have. And so I'm going to go back to why it is that they're actually looking at hormonal fluctuations. So part of that is because, like I said, in female athletes, their rate of ACL injuries is significantly higher than their male counterparts. And so there's been some thoughts that this might be linked to the difference in hormonal profiles in female versus male athletes. And there has been some research that's shown that specifically estrogen and progesterone could be linked to increased ligament laxity. And so what we mean by that is stretchiness, I guess, in a ligament is probably the best way to describe laxity, or its inability to produce kind of stability in an area. And so that is not new information. And again, this is people in the dance world have been reaching out and being like, oh my goodness, have you heard about this? And this is not new information. And there have actually been previous studies that have looked at the link between potentially these fluctuations in progesterone and estrogen that happen during the menstrual cycle and whether we can link those to injury. And that research has been fairly inconclusive. It is not fundamentally shown that, yes, this change in laxity is responsible for this increase in injury risk. So some of this research has already been done, and that's also why some people are like, okay, is this something we need to be funding right now, or should we be looking at other angles? But having more research in a field is never necessarily a bad thing, just to kind of add to that body of literature. So again, I don't think it's a bad thing that FIFA is studying this, but I don't think it is the be-all, end-all that people may think it is. So, like I said, estrogen and progesterone have potentially been linked to changes in ligament laxity, but that has not ever been definitively linked to any influence on actual injury risk. So we cannot say that just because we have changes in this laxity that we know that female athletes are going to be injured because of that. That link, that sort of causal link, has not been shown. We just know that there are changes in the amount of laxity we have in ligaments that change cyclically through our cycle. So that's kind of the first, I don't want to say issue, but the first thing that comes up when we're thinking about this research is, although we know that there are changes in laxity throughout the cycle, we don't actually know that that has any influence on injury risk. The other thing that I think is really, really, really important for us to be aware of is that this isn't something that we can control necessarily. So when we think about research, and especially sport medicine research, or when we're thinking about injury risk reduction or any of these concepts at play, we think about what we call the controllables. So things that we can influence and that we can change. And then we have the uncontrollables. And changes in or fluctuations in hormonal levels over the course of a menstrual cycle is an uncontrollable. We know that female athletes have a menstrual cycle, or they should. And if they don't, we have bigger issues going on when it comes to things like RED-S, so relative energy deficiency in sport. And that is a whole separate topic, and I will do a podcast episode on that, but I will bring on a guest who is an expert in that sort of area. So we know that female athletes will have a menstrual cycle, and they are still going to train and compete and play while on this menstrual cycle. And so we cannot necessarily change that. It is not a controllable as far as we are concerned. There are so many things that are controllables that we know have been linked to injury risk reduction in all sorts of different injuries and potentially in ACL injuries as well. And those are things like having access to appropriate strength training programs that are designed by qualified strength and conditioning coaches that are being delivered year round and are being monitored and are being dosed appropriately with training load for their athletic endeavors and things like that. Load management is massive when it comes to injury risk reduction. So people who, again, are monitoring the training load, and we've talked about training loads on this podcast, but training load is something that is absolutely controllable and modifiable by us and potentially has bigger impacts on this. Rest and recovery, something else, again, controllable. We have the ability to change and influence this. Proper nutrition and making sure that athletes are adequately fueled and are not falling into that relative energy deficiency or insufficiency when they are in training cycles. So there are so many things that are controllable when it comes to injury risk reduction. The fact that we're spending all this time and energy and money studying something that is largely uncontrollable seems a little bit counterproductive to me. We could be, or FIFA, I say we as if I'm involved in this. I am absolutely not involved. FIFA could be spending that same money and time and resources potentially to be looking at more of these controllables, looking at specific strength training or loading programs, looking at more load management, tracking statistics of like what type of load these athletes are under and things like that. And so I just feel like although this is fantastic that it is gaining more recognition and people are finally acknowledging that female athletes are not the same as male athletes, like we have to research and look at them differently, I'm not sure that specifically honing in on the hormonal profile of athletes is the most effective use of time and resources. So anyway, that's me getting off of my soapbox. I now want to bring it back to dance a little bit and sort of prove a point as to why I think that maybe these hormonal profiles are not the be-all and end-all, because we know that ACL injuries are really, really prevalent in sport. And one of the reasons they are getting so much publicity right now is because they have a really, really high, like we call it like a cost of burden, basically. So athletes who sustain an ACL injury, they require surgical reconstruction. And those athletes are generally out for a minimum of like 9 months would be a really short time frame for a return to sport. You see a few athletes be able to return within that time frame. More often, those athletes are looking at between 12 and 15 months, and some athletes more than 18 months to return to sport. So the burden of ACL injuries is really, really, really high. And in the past, these were actually considered career-ending injuries. And now with advancements in sports science and sports medicine and all of those things, they're not career-ending. People do come back and return to high levels of play after an ACL injury, but it takes a long time. We're looking at, on average, about a year for an athlete to return. So that is one of the reasons, or that is the reason why these injuries get so much attention, because they just have such a high burden or cost of burden on them. ACL injuries account for about 20% of athletic knee injuries, so not massively, massively high when we look at the overall percentage of knee injuries that are ACL injuries. But like I said, the burden of those injuries is significantly higher than other types of knee injuries that we see. We also know that between about 60 to 80% of ACL injuries are what are deemed non-contact injuries. So these are injuries that happen when an athlete is not having a contact with another athlete on the field. So in soccer players specifically, because we've been talking about that, there are some ACL injuries, so anywhere between, say, 20 and 40% that might actually happen from contact. So people go in for a tackle and get caught by another player's leg or something, and that could result in an injury. But a huge proportion of these, 60 to 80% of these, are actually non-contact. And these happen when an athlete is potentially planting their foot and then pivoting to change direction, or they're landing from going up for a header for a ball, or they're suddenly decelerating to, change direction or to do whatever it is. And so these are happening not through contact. And that's a really interesting feature of these injuries, because presumably, if they're happening non-contact, or the injuries that are a result of non-contact, those are, in theory, more preventable than the contact ones. There's always going to be a risk of injury in sport or in dance. And we've talked about that before. We're never going to get injury rates down to 0%. So the contact ones are probably much harder to prevent. These non-contact ones are what we are most interested in looking at, because if we can significantly decrease the rate of those happening, it's going to have like a really big effect overall on the burden of ACL injuries. So if we look at incidence rates in soccer, and again, they're high in soccer, we see about 3.7 ACL injuries for every 1,000 hours of exposure. And I've talked about like incidence and prevalence before in terms of like using that 1,000-hour exposure is a pretty common like measurement that we use in sport to kind of even things across the playing field. So 3.7 in soccer players per 1,000 hours. In dance, conversely, our ACL rate is 0.0009 per 1,000 exposure hours. So that's like not even 0.5%, or like half of an injury per 1,000 hours of exposure. ACL rates in dancers are very, very, very low. And this is super interesting because in theory, dance is a high impact activity that requires a lot of like deceleration and changing in directions and things like that are sort of in some ways similar to other athletic endeavors. But we have really, really, really low rates of ACL injuries in dance compared to in other sports. We know from other sports, and I've talked about this, female soccer players are 3 to 6 times more likely to sustain an ACL injury than their male counterparts. In dance, we actually see more ACL injuries in male dancers than we do in female dancers. And dance is predominantly female dominated. We have a lot more females involved in dance than we do males, yet we see more ACL injuries in the male dance population. So all of this, you can probably see where I'm headed with this, kind of maybe points to there being some other things at play besides just hormonal profiles that are protective in terms of preventing ACL injuries. And like I said, like we have a high proportion of female dancers, and all of those female dancers have menstrual cycles and have these fluctuations in hormone laxity that are in theory happening with changes in estrogen and progesterone levels, yet we do not see the high rate of especially non-contact ACL injuries that we see in other sporting populations. So that's partly why I feel like this is maybe not this, it's not, again, the be-all and end-all of what people are thinking it might be when it comes to ACL injury prevention. So there's been studies that have looked at this and actually compared dancers to other athletes to say, why do we see such a low rate of ACL injuries in dance compared to in other sporting populations? And there's been a few kind of like reasons or a few theories about why that might be. And one of the predominant theories is that dancers, or dance itself, requires such a high level of neuromuscular control that dancers are very, very, very aware of exactly how and sort of how, I guess, they are controlling their body, and especially landing from, say, jumps or changing direction or decelerating. They have a lot more expertise or movement experience in terms of the neuromuscular control required for that than maybe is seen in other athletic pursuits. Dancers arguably also have higher or increased body awareness. Dancers are very, very, very body aware, or are very like kinesthetically aware of how their body is functioning. And so that is also thought to potentially be a protective factor in terms of them being able to know exactly where their body is in space and how they're landing. Most of these non-contact ACL injuries that happen, like I said, they come from changing direction or decelerating or things like that. And most of them involve what is called a valgus force at the knee. So that would be if you were standing in parallel and you were to do like a knee bend. Normally, we would want that knee to track directly forward over top of our foot. So it would be in line with like our foot, and ideally sort of like second-ish toe of your foot. You would see nice straight alignment coming from the hip to the knee to the foot. Everything would be lined up. In a valgus force, what you'll see is the knee dives inwards towards the midline. So it would drop inside of where the foot is. So like sort of inwards of that first toe or first ray. So if somebody was to do the knee bend, their hip might stay lined up over their foot, but the knee ends up dropping inwards, and you see a little bit of an angle develop between the thigh bone and the lower leg bone. That's called a valgus force. And a lot of ACL injuries are thought to be attributed to that valgus force happening on landing or changing direction. In dance, we work in turnout a lot of the time for a lot of styles of dance. And that turnout position, when done properly and correctly, is actually training the opposite of valgus. Like, dancers are developing the strength and the neuromuscular control to activate the muscles that counter that valgus force. So that is likely a big protective mechanism as well in terms of preventing or reducing the risk of ACL injuries in dance. And dancers are just like the technique of dance. That is one of the fundamental techniques that's drilled into young dancers from a very, very, very young age. One of the first things you learn when you start dancing, especially in, ballet or other Western classical forms, is first position and doing like a demi-plie in first position and opening your knees outwards. So right from, baby ballerinas, we're training that neuromuscular control to be able to counter that valgus force that's potentially happening in the knee. And we don't see that in other athletic populations or in other athletic pursuits. There are some programs. There's a program called 11 Plus that was designed by FIFA that is a neuromuscular training program, essentially, that was developed to be used as like a warm-up for soccer players and as an ACL prevention tool. So it actually looks at training a lot of those things. And there's been good success with that program. Unfortunately, it's just not been adopted, worldwide necessarily. So the idea, I think, from the 11 Plus program was that every soccer player in the world, like grassroots, semi-professional, professional, didn't matter, would be participating in this type of neuromuscular warm-up and conditioning to have that protective effect. But it's not necessarily been adopted across the board, although the research supports that when it is being used, it does have an effect on reducing ACL injuries. So, like I was saying with dance, the fact that dancers are so trained from, again, such a young age or young level to control those knee movements and really make sure that their technique and their alignment is sort of quote unquote perfected is likely protective against ACL injuries. And then the other thing that we've talked about as sort of not a negative thing, but just in terms of like it's what's the right wording? It's risk in terms of injury. It is the fact that dance is really high impact and repetitive. So we've talked about the fact that, there's on average more than 200 jump landings in a single class, depending on what style that is. And about half of those jump landings are usually single leg jump landings. So I've talked about this before when we've talked about like footwear and flooring and all sorts of things where we have that high impact, and that can be detrimental to a dancer's body if we're not managing training load. But the positive part of that high impact in dancers doing so much repetitive landing, and especially like that single leg landing where they're learning to control that, is that they have built up strength and load tolerance and neuromuscular control to those landing patterns. So dancers generally have more efficient landing patterns from jumping type movements than another athlete from another sport. And if we think about, say, basketball or volleyball or other sports like basketball, there's a reasonably high rate of ACL injuries, again, especially in female basketball players. They have a lot of impact landings and they come down from a lot of jumps and potentially from even like higher heights than dancers might be, but they've maybe never been trained on the mechanics of those landings as much as dancers have been trained on the mechanics of the landings. So potentially that is one of the reasons that we might see this protective effect of dance to prevent ACL injuries compared to other sports. So I just wanted to highlight that because, like I said, everybody's getting really, 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 really excited about the hormonal component of these ACL injuries. But if we take dance as an example, to contrast or compare that to other sporting populations, we have very, very low rates of ACL injury despite an incredibly high female participation. And that doesn't matter if we're looking at young dancers or adolescent dancers or professional dancers. There are proportionately more female dancers than there are male dancers, and we still have very, very low rates of ACL injuries. So again, that's not to like be a little bit of a Debbie Downer and be like, oh, they shouldn't be funding this study. But I think if we think about where our priorities should be when it comes to funding research and looking at what moves the dial the most, we really want to be spending our time and effort and looking at some of the controllable factors. So again, access to strength training, making sure we have appropriate load management, rest and recovery strategies, proper nutrition programs, all of those things that potentially are going to be bigger dial movers than just looking at the hormonal profiles of athletes. So again, I think it's amazing that they're starting to actually treat female athletes differently than male athletes and really look at how do they need to be trained differently. But I think the real question should potentially be, how should a female athlete's strength training program potentially be modified because they're female? Or what does their load management look like? We can absolutely apply these things to a female-specific population, but I'm not sure that looking only at hormonal profiles and hormonal fluctuations is really going to give us the best bang for our buck. So that is all I'm going to say about that. Like I said, I had tons of people reaching out, asking my opinion and being very excited about this study. And so I just thought the easiest way to address this was to do a podcast episode. I will likely do a part 2 on specifically ACL injuries, a little bit more of like the actual like pathophysiology and what we do for treatment. Because like I said, although the rate of them is low in dancers, we do still see ACL injuries. And so I do think it is a topic that's worth diving into a little bit, just to talk about what that injury looks like specifically in dancers and considerations for rehabilitation programs and things like that. So keep your eye out for part 2 of ACLs that will be much more dance specific, as opposed to today just kind of addressing what came out in terms of this announcement with the FIFA funding of this study. Would love to hear your thoughts and opinions on this. I don't know how many people were aware of the FIFA study if you don't kind of follow a lot of the same sports circles, but I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions. Send me a message, reach out to me on social media at Dance Physio Erika, or send me an email. I always love to hear feedback from people. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.